So we're starting a brand new series, and it's about comparison. And the idea behind this series, we're going to spend 3 weeks thinking about it. We're kind of taking a break from the idea of walking through a book of the Bible. I love doing that, but I also like to break away and talk about a topic every once in a while. So we're going to take 3 weeks to talk about this idea of comparison. Sometimes I think about a theme verse or a theme quote that kind of encapsulates a series, and the quote that I continually think about, it's been attributed to Theodore Roosevelt, and it's just this: the comparison is the thief of joy. So that's the quote that I want you to be thinking about when we go through this. You're going to hear it every week as we think about this series. I want you to be thinking about that, how comparison steals the joy in your life. And if comparison shows up anywhere in our lives, it's social media. There you are, you're scrolling, you've got your phone, and you're just scrolling through TikTok, a video after video, or you've got Instagram, Snapchat open, and it can be someone's clothes that they wear that you're all of a sudden jealous of. That shows up in my life. I'll be scrolling through social media, and social media knows what you shop for, and so they know the shoes that you like. They know where you like to shop for clothes. If you look through my social media, I think you'll see sneakers, barbecue equipment, because our kids director Tyler has got me into smoking meat, which I love. Just all sorts of things. You'll see what you love everywhere. In fact, I happen to think that even if social media wasn't pawning us off a little bit, we know, like, social media uses technology to put that stuff in front of us, right? And so we're constantly thinking about these things that we want, these things that we don't have. But even if it weren't just social media, sometimes our mind and our brain works in such a way that we zero in on this one thing. So it's that car that person has, and if I just had that car, if I had that ability, that educational, like, man, the person is so smart, they get such good grades, if I could just think the way that they think. And we compare ourselves and our stuff, our money, to other people. And it's dangerous. Why? Because it steals our joy. This gets really dangerous for us because all of a sudden what happens is it's not just, I wish I had that thing, oh, I'm bummed that I don't have that thing, but it affects our hearts in a very real way. We start to feel bad about ourselves. We start to feel upset. In fact, sometimes I think it can color a whole day, and you start thinking about, I'm that kind of person that doesn't have that kind of thing, or that kind of ability, or those grades, or that. It can start to affect your moods, and your emotions can start to affect your self-image. It can start to make you feel bad about yourself, and that is not a good thing. There's this great teacher in the New Testament named Paul, and he wrote a lot of the letters, and he was really known for being direct. He was constantly calling people out. If he was a preacher on YouTube or on TikTok today, he would have gotten a lot of comments, both good and bad. Paul was the kind of guy who, when he would call people out, sometimes people would take it like, he's talking to me. Sometimes you're sitting in a sermon and you're like, is he following me around, listening to me? Because I feel like this message is right towards me. Well, sometimes people, like we tend to do, would lash out at him and would be very upset. Well, Paul responded this way in the book of 2 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians 10 verse 12 said, "Not that we dare to classify or compare ourselves with some of those who are commending themselves," or, in other words, really excited about how awesome they are. They talk about how good they are all the times. We're not trying to compare ourselves to that because they're comparing themselves to other people. So we're not getting in the comparison game, is what Paul is saying. Not that we dare to classify or compare ourselves with those people. But when they measure themselves by one another and compare themselves with one another, they are without understanding. The New Living Translation actually says, how ignorant. Because what Paul knew, as we should learn, is that when we compare ourselves to each other, we're using a standard that was never meant for us. Our goal is never to compare each other. That's never something that Jesus said. Make sure that you pay attention to everyone else and compare each other and contrast what you have, what you don't have, how good you are, how much you've grown, how much you haven't grown. That's never a value in the New Testament. Paul's going to call it ignorant because the truth is that is a dangerous practice that can hurt us, but we don't know how much it hurts us until we find ourselves in a pit of despair. Maybe you've been there. I have definitely been there, where maybe I'll drive down the street and I'll see someone that has a nicer car than me, and all of a sudden I'll start to feel bad about the car. Or maybe more serious because a car is a car, right? Let's talk about this. What about someone who has a better education than you, or someone who seems to be smarter than you? It can take you to a place where you start to feel bad about yourself. Think about it this way. What about someone who was in a relationship with someone that you want to be in a relationship with? That gets pretty dangerous right there, right? You start to feel like, well, why aren't they in a relationship with me? What do they have that I don't have? And again, over and over and over, we start to find ourselves in these dangerous places where we start to think things about ourselves that are untrue, and then all of a sudden we start maybe to believe them. That's a really dangerous thing. One of my favorite proverbs of all time is Proverbs 4:23. It says this: above all else, guard your heart, because everything else flows out of that. Another version says this: keep your heart with all vigilance, for from it flow the springs of life. I think what this proverb is telling us is that things enter our heart through our eyes, ears, and our senses, right? We are seeing things all day, and especially with social media, we're seeing and hearing things, and we begin to compare ourselves, and all of a sudden it goes from our eyes, but then it hits our emotions, and then it seeps down into our heart, and we start to sometimes let it take root. Sometimes comparison can actually take root in your heart. And your heart, Proverbs 4:23 says, we need to be guarding our heart. You can't just let everything sink deeply into your heart to root in. So if you are going to let bitterness take a root in your heart, that's dangerous. If you're going to let comparison take root in your heart, that's dangerous. Why? For from it flows everything else. One of the things that Jesus constantly talked about was how you can't desecrate someone from what comes in them, it's from what comes out of them. And what he's always talking about, Jesus' message over and over and over again, you can see it weaved through every message that he speaks, is that the heart is what he's after, right? It's not that he wants you to be obedient all the time just to be obedient, because if you're obedient but your heart's not in the right place, what's the point? It's not that he just wants you to attend church or to be a part of an LBS crew if your heart's not in it, because what's the point? And this is a sticky point for a lot of people. It's not that he needs your money or wants you to give money to the church just to check it off the list. He just wants to know that he has your heart. If your heart is truly surrendered to Jesus, then all of that starts to flow out of it. Another image that Jesus uses is this idea of fruit. You have a tree that has a certain kind of fruit. So think of it like an apple tree. And if there's apples on a tree, you know it's not an orange tree. You know that there's not going to be one day bananas hanging off of that tree. An apple tree is going to produce apples. What Jesus would say is that you'll know a tree by its fruit. Or in other words, deep inside that tree is the DNA that bears apples. So let me just ask you, what's the fruit that comes out of what's going on inside of your heart? You know that your words tend to be a direct display of what's going on in your heart. So if you're constantly comparing yourselves to other people and you're constantly wishing, and you may be even saying out loud, like, I wish I had that thing that they have. I wish I could do that like they have. All of a sudden, your words begin to kind of display what's going on in your heart. And what we're after is hearts after Jesus. You gotta know that we're talking about comparison. And why does comparison matter? Because comparison is a gateway drug to a very dangerous place where our hearts are not surrendered to Jesus. Because a heart that's surrendered to Jesus is content and it's peaceful, because a heart that's surrendered to Jesus understands that Jesus is everything that we need. So here's a question I want you to ask. I wrote down a couple questions here, and I want you to think about these pretty deeply. What are the things that are fueling how I feel? So sometimes when we scroll social media, we tend to think, I wish I looked like that person. I wish I had what they had. I wish I had those things. What are the things that are fueling how you feel? Sometimes social media is something that happens so mindlessly, but it impacts you so much more than you think. So maybe you need to make an intentional decision to put the phone down. I'm not saying social media is evil. I am saying sometimes it triggers some pretty dangerous things. The second thing, what are some things I want to do because of how I feel? If I want something that someone else has, maybe I spend too much money on that thing. Or maybe I start to pursue at all costs how to acquire that thing or that ability or that relationship or that status. If you're mastered by the things that you see on social media, then you're not mastered by Jesus. if you're mastered by Jesus, you tend to answer this question. Well, let me just go ahead and ask you to think about it. What are some of the things I want to do because of how I feel? Well, if you are mastered by Jesus, then you serve Jesus and you can find your identity and your hope and your contentment in Jesus. People that have their identity in Jesus tend to seek after those things less. Sometimes we think they're weird because they're not keeping up with the Joneses. But the truth is, they've wrapped up their identity all in Jesus and they see things from a different lens. And I want to tell you, the people, the heroes in my life, the spiritual heroes in my life that have found their identity in Christ are pursuing a life that, quite honestly, is refreshing to me. Because all of a sudden, we're not trying to keep up with the Joneses. We're not trying to live our life based on image or comparison, but just simply, how can I glorify Jesus? The third question I want you to think about is, what or who am I comparing myself to that's bringing up these feelings? Now, that's a dangerous one, and you may already know who it is or what it is. Maybe it's a specific person in your school. Maybe it's a celebrity, which, by the way, we have gotten used to photoshopping people before they end up on magazine covers, which is a picture for us of just how unattainable that comparison is. But we get lost, we get steeped, we get trapped comparing ourselves to these people when truly we're chasing after something that doesn't even exist because even they are photoshopped. So if it's body image, if it's money, if it's going to the right college, whatever it is, if it's getting that car when you turn 16, let me just help you. It's a trap. Comparison is a trap. So here's what I'll say. Social media is not evil, but I will say I want you to challenge yourself this week to not compare your worth to their posts. Don't compare your worth to their posts, meaning this. What is it that you are rooting your identity in? We've talked about this before, but it really touches every single Bible story that we read. So if it's Daniel, you know the decisions that you make, the convictions that you have because of the identity that you have. If you're in Philippians, right? Paul, who's writing from a prison, and he's writing about how we can have joy in Christ despite all of our circumstances. That's the idea of someone who's not based on comparison. Because what would Paul compare himself to? People who aren't in jail. But somehow Paul, who was in prison, found contentment in Christ even because he was in that tough situation. I know we just got done studying Philippians a couple months ago, but let me just go ahead and read this. Not that I'm speaking of being in need, for I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low and I know how to abound. And in every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. So fight the fight of comparison, right? Like, don't get in that trap. Don't fall in that trap. And let's learn how to be content in any situation that we find ourselves.